Welcome to the Colorado Channel State Senate Year in Review. I'm CBS 4's political specialist, Sean Boyd, and joining me here today is the State Senate Majority Leader.
I'm John Morse from Colorado Springs.
And the Assistant Minority Leader.
I'm Bill Cadman from Senate District 10, also in Colorado Springs, but all the way out to Calhan and past Peyton, obviously, and out to Truckton and a lot of other wonderful rural places in El Paso County.
We're going to start with you, Senator.
Great.
Cadman, what do you see as the biggest legislative achievement this year?
Well, for us, probably the budget. I mean, we actually, for the first time in the 11 years I've been in the General Assembly, had a bipartisan agreement that both houses actually came to the table for and got signed by the governor. So it was an interesting process. The nature of the assembly being bipartisan, with one house controlled by the Democrats and one house controlled by the Republicans, really, I think, pushed us together to come up with something that people could live with. It wasn't perfect, but it was prudent.
Senator Morse, you want to take that one? Biggest legislative achievement?
I think the budget was definitely huge, there's no question. But to list another one, I think one of the things that really slipped under the radar was we changed the unemployment insurance to solidify that. And we did that also in a bipartisan way. It was carried by the chair of the Business Committee in the House, which is a Republican, and I carried it in the Senate. But it changes the way that we do that, modernizes it so that we can collect the money to pay off the federal debt that we accrued in this last recession and to make the fund more solvent for the next inevitable downturn. Hopefully it won't be as downturn as we're going through now, but the business cycle does cycle.
Let's talk about the biggest disappointment. Senator Morse, you want to take that first?
I mean, redistricting is no doubt the answer. I mean, it would have been nice to have been able to come up with a solution redistricting-wise, but I firmly believe that both parties and, frankly, both chambers were involved in that conversation, did do the best that they could, but there is just some fundamental disagreement, and that's purely a political process. And so, you know, I can't get my friends across the aisle to vote against their political interests for the next 10 years. So we really did get to a point where this is as far as I can go, and this is as far as you can go, and there's a gap.
Senator Cadman, would you agree?
Yeah, we would agree. Redistricting was a big one. It was certainly a hurdle that we did not overcome. We had all high hopes right up to, frankly, the 11th hour that we would come to some agreement, and unfortunately it didn't happen. There was a lot of finger pointing at the time. We don't have to rehash those. If you want to see the debate, you can go to the Colorado Channel and pull that up on your own. But that was a great disappointment. I think also from our side, from a Republican perspective, we're disappointed that there wasn't more done to help small businesses and help Colorado families in the marketplace finding jobs. We had a lot of proposals that were killed that we think would have been jobs builders in Colorado. Colorado's lost 65,000 jobs in the last 10 years in the private sector. Interestingly enough, we've grown public sector jobs by 51,000. So we're seeing certainly a disparity in the job growth in the private sector. We believe that the economy and Colorado families would be well served by private sector jobs, and we saw a lot of what we considered great proposals killed.
Although you did get some of the dirty dozen repealed.
We got a couple of them.
So you both have talked about the split legislature. Democrats control the Senate, Republicans the House. As a result of that, I think we often see a lot of incremental change, not a lot of monumental change. What would you describe as the tone this session? Senator Cadman?
You know, I actually think the tone, with a few exceptions, was very diplomatic. Protocol, I think, was maintained. There was a good working relationship. Part of that comes in the Senate because many of us have been around the building for a while, and many of us have worked together now. You know, John and I have worked together now for 4 or 5 years, and going into your 5th year. So you don't have to rehash any of that political debate on a daily basis. You know there's a job to do, and sometimes you can just focus on the task at hand. So I think, again, the tone was great, and for the most part.
Senator Morris, you agree? Good tone?
You know, largely I do agree, and I think, you know, the people that watch on the Colorado Channel probably see that an awful lot, where it's like, wait, I'm really waiting for the fireworks and for these guys to really go after one another. And it doesn't happen as much. I do think the difference, though, was that you did see, frankly, on both sides, some political grandstanding because you could. You know, it was possible for Republicans in the House to introduce a far-right bill that they knew if it made it through the House, it would die in the Senate, and they didn't have to worry about it actually becoming law, but they could trump it for all the way through the committee hearings and then on the floor and pass and then off to the Senate. And the same thing on the Democratic side, starting in the Senate, moving to the House, where you could introduce some things that you knew darn good and well were not actually going to become law, and so you didn't have to fine-tune it because we're going to have to live under this. You rather could be more political about it. But still, it was done, you know, politely and with respect for the other side's
Civil
ideas.
discourse.
Absolutely,
That's
in
great.
my view.
So you touched on redistricting. How close did you get? Why didn't it happen? Really?
You know, I think you'll get two different answers to this question, which I think really tells you the different ways to view whether the glass is half empty or half full. But I think it really came down to the Republicans wanted it split based on communities of interest, and the Democrats wanted it split based on competitive districts.
I would agree.
And so, you know, you can define those two in two different ways, and so we couldn't get there.
And the governor told me, he said, it came real close based on the meetings that he had with both party leaders.
Yeah, I would agree. It was close. Probably from a logistics point, though, we were very far from ever getting it to the next step, which if a bill doesn't make it to conference committee, you never have an opportunity for both houses to find that compromise. And unfortunately, we never had a bill that was sent out of the Senate to get to a conference committee with the House. And I think that shortchanged the public. It certainly felt like it shortchanged the process. For someone who's been through redistricting one time before, that was an essential component that didn't happen through some maneuvering in the Senate, frankly.
So let's talk about some of the more emotionally charged pieces of legislation this session. We'll start with civil unions. 3 Republicans voted for this in the Senate, made it to committee in the House where it died, but some of the Republicans who voted against it on that committee told me this was a very difficult decision. Attitudes appear to be changing. If this comes back next session, which we all know history often repeats down there, what chances would you give it a passing? Senator Morse?
I think in the long run, the chances it passes are 1 out of 1. I mean, I think 10, 15 years from now, we look back and say, really, what were we arguing about? Next year, nothing changes really in terms of the dynamics of the legislature, and I think if it happened the same way next year as this year, it may meet the same result. It would get out of the Senate, probably with several Republican votes, but I suspect it would be sent to a committee in the House where it would die. After the election in 2012, so for 2013 session, I think we could see a difference because again there, everyone, or not everyone, half the senators and all of the representatives will again have to go out to the public and get reelected. And I think more and more people are going to say, hey, this is what we want, knock this off.
That's if Democrats win back some of
No,
the seats.
I don't think that, not
Regardless.
even counting that. I mean, of course, if the Democrats can take back the House, then I think that bill passes and gets signed and it becomes law. But I think even if not, I think more and more the Republicans are going to get pressure because, again, I think 10 years from now, we're going to look back at all this and say, that was really stupid. I can't believe that was happening.
Senator Cadman, what's your take on
Well, it's a super emotionally charged issue, and it's come in several forms over the years there. This is probably the biggest bite at the apple that I've seen an attempt to take. I think what's interesting, though, is if it was so important to the Democrats to pass this bill, why didn't they run it when they were in control of both houses and the governor's office?
It is a good question.
If this is a real tenet of what they believe is their political and public policy future, then run it when you have controls of every handle of government. I don't see it passing next year. It's certainly a tight margin in the House. So if there were ever an opportunity of something being passed out of the Senate from a strongly Democrat support to a very narrow controlled House, it really wouldn't change until there was another body elected in another year from now.
So, beer bills.
Beer bills.
Got to talk about the beer bills. What is this, the fourth year? Beer bills?
Gosh.
See, and they're
They're always
mostly in the
there.
House, so we haven't had to deal with them much.
They've gone down, not even on party line votes. Why do they keep failing? Why do they keep coming back? Senator Cadman?
Well, we have a pretty distorted marketplace, and basically, because the government's involved, it's a very historic issue. The blue laws date back farther than even Senator Morris can remember. He's old. But this has been a fight many, many times over in my time in the legislature, and frankly, they die one attempt at a time. My take on it, and I was going to be the sponsor of a bill that if it made it out of the House, is let's stop punishing the consumers to favor one group in the marketplace over another that wants to capture a specific market from a specific group. It doesn't make any sense to me that you should drive from one place to another to buy something that's available 2 doors down or 2 blocks away. It's a little bit archaic to have this separation in beer. To me, beer is beer. And again, the consumers ought to be our main focus. Our constituents at the consumer level should be the main focus. And I would support trying to equalize access to whatever the products are.
Although there is some concern, what happens to all of those liquor stores out there, you know, that set up shop next to the grocery store under the current rules, trying to play by those rules? What do you think, Senator Morris, in terms of the chances that it'll come back and ever pass?
Yeah, it'll come back. The chance of that is 1.
Yeah.
You know, pass, I mean, happens year by year. We have to wait and see, because I do think that this issue sort of highlights one of the iron rules of politics, and that is he who is going to be damaged by the legislation will lobby louder and harder than he who is going to benefit. And I think that happens all over the place. So once we set up a system, even if it was, you know, in 1935, a system coalesces around it. Mm-hmm. And it's absolutely true that if we change that, we will change the world for liquor stores who have tried to play by the rules. That's not to say that's necessarily a bad thing. It is a bad thing from their perspective, but it is absolutely right that from a consumer's perspective, it's different. From the small convenience stores operating gas stations and whatnot, it's also different. They would love to have that margin and do it. But those are the competing influences that's why this is not as simple as, you know, hey, I want to be able to buy beer wherever I want in the state. I mean, yes, but there's a price to that, and part of the price is you're yanking the rug out from under some small business, and the business people that I talk about, they're way less concerned about taxes and things like that than they are in the stability of the rules. Tell us what the rules are, we will play by them, but stop changing the rules in middle of the game.
It is very complicated. I'm sure we'll be sitting here talking about this again this time next year. In-state tuition for illegal immigrants is another very emotionally charged issue. It passed in the Senate, failed in committee in the House. The fiscal note actually showed a net gain of millions of dollars for higher ed, and we know where higher ed is these days. We start with you, Senator Morris. Is there any change that you would have made in this piece of legislation, if you could, that would have caused it to pass, do you think?
Boy, I mean, I voted for it, obviously, and I like it because the way that it's couched is totally ridiculous to me. I mean, and even the way you just said, you know, this is college tuition for illegal immigrants. I mean, this is college tuition in-state. They pay in-state, just like everyone else. Right now, they have to pay out-of-state, which Colorado has some of the highest out-of-state tuition rates in the country, so it makes it just completely impossible for these folks to be able to afford it. This would get them to where they could do in-state tuition. And this is people that moved here, children that moved here when they were 3. You know, now granted, the rule is they have to have been here for 4 years, so they might have moved here, you know, when they were 14 or 15. But many of them have been here their entire lives. There's no place to, quote unquote, deport them to. They don't even speak the language, and yet we classify them as illegal immigrants because of what their parents did. And now their opportunity is limited. And we also, the argument is, you know, yeah, but if we let them do this, then that's a motivation and people will come across the border anyway. It's like people have been coming across the border for decades, for 240 years that we know of. I mean, this is going to continue to happen. We need to manage our immigration because we are the greatest place on earth. We should expect everyone will want to come here.
There are some concerns. How does this conflict with federal law, too, out there? let me ask you, Senator Cadman, is there anything that would have made this more palatable for Republicans, do you think?
Not in my opinion. And we actually had some Republicans, I believe, that voted for it. But for the most part, we believe it's generating a benefit for a family who came here illegally. And if you believe in the rule of law, it has to apply unilaterally and universally. And making an exception for this means we should make an exception for everything. You know, if I steal a car, it doesn't make it any more legal if I hand it to my kids, right? Well, if I steal this opportunity from the state or the country by coming here illegally, it doesn't make it any more, it doesn't grant it morality by me handing the benefit to my kids. And I mean, it was certainly one of the more heated debates that we had.
It was very emotional.
And
tears in the chamber.
It'll come back next year.
But, you know, I mean, to just very quickly, you stole a car, you get convicted of that, now you can't go to college. And more importantly, now your children can't go to college.
I think the analogy is because you steal the car, do your kids get punished?
But there's no question, it's an emotional issue, and that's why the answer to your question, I think Senator Cadman has given, and that there wasn't something we could do to get it.
The car is just is a metaphor. The car is the opportunity. Education is the opportunity. If I steal access to the opportunity, can I make it right by handing it off and saying, no, my kids have it now? It doesn't make it right. So that's, I mean, it's, again, we're not really here to debate, I guess, the sides of the issue, but it's certainly, and you mentioned the fiscal note. Fiscal notes are interesting. And I could probably show you plenty of evidence that actually shows that that's an increased cost to the state that wasn't reflected in the fiscal note. So again, if you want to debate that specifically, we could probably do 2 or 3 shows on that by itself.
But I think it'll be back, don't you?
Sure. The question is, again, does it come back next year, or do we wait an extra year? Because, again, I think the Hispanic population is going to have an influence on both parties. And so, again, I think in the long run, but I think you also make a good point that they could handle this at the national level, and then we'd have a lot less to deal with on the local level.
And I think that was what Republicans' argument was, too.
Right. There's a significant conflict between promoting this and, as you cited in your opening statement about this issue, federal law.
Yeah. So let's talk about what legislation you were most proud of, Senator Cadman.
Well, when you're in the minority, you're most proud of the things that you kill. So I'd say, you know, actually, probably parts of the budget, the things that we were able to affect over 2.5, 3 weeks of negotiating, making some real revisions in the budget. We finally eliminated 700 positions that were being held in the budget for future expenditures. We were able to restore, with, again, a bipartisan effort, restore $100 million of cuts to K-12. From the original proposal by the governor, and we were able to restore about $25 million to Colorado families and businesses through some of the tax credit issues. So we believe that these are the types of policies that are needed to put Colorado families back to work, and we got many components included in this year's budget, which we wouldn't have done had we not picked up at least one chamber.
Senator Morse? Most proud of? I know you had touched on the unemployment one earlier. Is there anything else that you got in the budget, maybe?
Well, no, because the budget was, he got, I gave.
Right.
I think other than the unemployment thing, Speaker McNulty, who obviously is a Republican, carried the bill in the Senate, in the House, and I carried in the Senate a bill to adopt the state implementation plan for clean air so that we can send that on to the feds and it becomes our plan and we don't have to worry about the EPA coming in and imposing something on us. So I think that was something that I was proud that we were able to do because, again, it was, I can't really say it was bipartisan because sort of like the beer bill, there were plenty of Democrats that voted no and plenty of Republicans that voted yes and vice versa in both chambers. So that was also tricky to do as we talk about energy and the new energy economy and how do we clean up our air in Colorado because we've got some physics to deal with because of our altitude.
Democrats and Republicans did come together on health care exchanges. Why did it become so controversial, do you think, Senator Morse?
Well, I think healthcare reform is nationally a political football. And while I personally believe that the richest country on earth shouldn't be the only country, the only industrialized country in the world that doesn't provide adequate healthcare for people, everybody doesn't agree with me. And so this passed on the national level. Here's a piece of it that we need to implement on the state level, and I think, even though I will obviously let Senator Cadman talk about the Republican perspective, but from their perspective, this is sort of the least of any evil. And so let's do it because we have to, not because we want to, but we don't want the feds doing it to us. And as opposed to the Democrats, it's like, this is a huge opportunity to try to make sure that more people have access to health care throughout the state. Let's get as much of that as we can, while pushing back from the other side that let's do as little as we can because we hate the whole concept. So this was a huge political football, and I think it's a hats off that we got it done. Again, both parties, both chambers.
Senator Cadman, I know.
Well, I think
Amy Stevens took a lot of heat.
Sure. It was a tighter vote than saying this was a certainly solid bipartisan effort. I mean, it was it certainly wasn't universally bipartisan. And I think the issue with the whole healthcare exchange, well, the couple of the healthcare exchange bills, is the fact that some of them are so tied to the federal mandate and Obamacare. It's very tough to separate the rhetoric from the reality. And unfortunately, in this case, the rhetoric and the reality are part of them are, I mean, it's bad. I mean, it's bad for us. I mean, one of the biggest problems in our state budget, like every state budget, is federal mandates in healthcare now. I mean, we're at 22%, John, of our budget is going for human services and Medicaid, and it's growing. We can't afford the programs we have now, and anything tying us to the continued mandates under the Obamacare system, I think, is detrimental to us and detrimental to every other state. To acquiesce to their coercion by coming up with this separate standard, I think, is not palatable to many of us. Sometimes you have to fight, sometimes you have to accept, and this is one area where some of us have decided that we just can't accept what the feds are trying to do, and we're going to fight it with every inch of our political will. And unfortunately, this exchange bill was too closely tied politically and structurally to the mandates from the federal government.
Felt like another federal mandate.
Absolutely.
That's what it would become. Any surprises this session, Senator Cadman?
Surprises. I'd like to say there were some interesting surprises during redistricting, because we had a very bipartisan opposition to some of the Democrat plans that were coming out of the House. So when you're sitting through a committee, and I served on the committee that listened to a lot of these bills, when you're sitting on the committee and you're listening to significant Democrats from across the state showing up to tell the Democrats that they don't like their plan, you kind of wonder what side of the world you woke up on.
The wrong side.
Yeah, right. Obviously the right side, and more people were coming with us. So some of the very interesting testimony during redistricting, and frankly, some of the proposals that came out during redistricting were certainly interesting.
Senator Morse, any big surprise?
Probably no big surprise, but I sort of, in a different twist on the same vein, some of my favorite memories down there are on the Senate floor, huddling around the podium, we call it the well, trying to hammer stuff out. And we did that with redistricting. We did it with the budget. And occasionally it happens on other bills too, where there's just a bunch of Democrats and a bunch of Republicans, and then they get all mixed up, and then I wish the world could see it. I mean, generally, the microphone's not on at the time because we're using it as a meeting place. We don't do that. When we're on, we're on. But it's so much fun to just, okay, I see what you're saying. I mean, I can't agree with that, or I can't go that far, but that is a good point that I hadn't considered. That kind of.
But there was a lot of give and take.
Right. And here, I mean, we had to, because it's got to pass the House.
Sure.
So, I mean, you can't rule the roost here.
Maybe the surprise is how much got done.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, because we knew we had to get a budget done. We knew we would get a budget done. Would it take a special session to do? I never thought so. But we pushed that to the last minute too. But nothing sort of focuses the mind like a deadline.
Well, I'm surprised it came down to payday loans in the end.
Oh, yeah, okay. That would have been a good one.
Payday
That
loans
was
was
true.
getting to rehash the payday loan debate from last year because of the rules was another very interesting debate.
So how was the governor to work with, Senator Morse?
Great. He's a great human being, great personality, cares very deeply about the state. No question he was getting his sea legs. He was still trying to figure out which end was up. How do we do things? How do we not do things? How do I get along with the Republicans? How do I get along with the Democrats? Because he's coming from a whole different angle. He's only got whatever he's got, 8 or 10 years, I guess, of political experience total. He's a little bit better than me, but not much. Came from non-political into a political sphere, and now I think the change from being the mayor of Denver to being the governor of Colorado is huge, because I think he was a strong mayor in a strong mayor system, and now he wants to be a strong governor in what is a weak governor system. It's the legislature really that does an awful lot, and so I think he's still trying to figure out how do you play this and get what you need to get through both chambers with different parties controlling each.
Senator Cadman.
He was welcoming. He was absolutely doors open. You come talk to me, and he mentioned in the State of the State, he's mentioned to people one-on-one, I want to think outside politics. I want to think outside what's normal, and he's engaging. I would say from the Republican side, we found a lot of alliances in public policy from his State of the State through many of the bills that we carried. Unfortunately, none of them saw the light of day to get to the House and finally see if he would sign them or not. So one of the issues with being the governor is you don't have to take a specific position on many things that don't end up at your desk. And if we're looking at working with him during the interim to find very specific areas where he would like to get to his desk and hopefully get some support from him through the legislative process, because that's what it's going to take.
There was talk that maybe the split legislature really saved him some tough decisions because you had more of the moderate legislation that made it to his desk, you think?
Well, I think a split legislature saves any governor,
yeah.
frankly,
Yeah.
from having to
There's
take
no
some
extremes.
tough stands. Sure.
And it is funny because I do the same thing. Constituents will frequently ask me, where do you stand on a bill that is in the committee in the House and it hasn't gotten over to the Senate yet? It's like, I have not had a chance to look, won't have a chance to look, won't look until I have to because I've got so much else to do. So I get that that's what he does, and he has to do that to a large extent. And right now there's a huge benefit because, there's going to be very little that's going to get through that hasn't been completely vetted by both political parties.
Mm-hmm. Budget is going to be a big issue again next year. We all know that. Any predictions for what we should look for, Senator Cadman? You had talked about Medicare. The budget is so limited where
Sure.
you go with it because you have 4 or 5 things that eat up the money there.
I'll tell you what, states really need help at the federal level right now. We need help from our legislative members in the Colorado delegation. Every state needs help. You see a lot of references to folks looking for waivers from the current federal legislation in healthcare, from the ramifications of Obamacare in the future, and we're in the same place now. We have increased the Medicaid budget here by billions of dollars over the last decade, and when you're coming up short at the end of the day, you look at the things that are growing the fastest, and it is that Medicaid component, and the federal government has locked us into our own spending. So they're hanging a noose around our neck, and frankly the neck of every state that's in the federal Medicaid program. We need some relief from that, or we are going to continue to cannibalize the other things that tax money, I believe, needs to go for, the K-12, higher ed, roads, bridges, infrastructure, water. It's all being cannibalized by this mandatory growth in healthcare spending.
I think 80% of the budget or something is education and Medicaid combined.
40, 60, 63, 64%, those two things combined.
So what are your predictions? Where do we go from here?
It's going to be a very tight economy. Obviously, Senator Cadman and I disagree on the overall big picture because, you know, the reality is we as a country need to provide health care for everybody, just like the rest of the world already does. And the rest of the world spends a lot less money doing it, covers everybody, and has better outcomes. So we have to change the way we do health care in this country. And right this minute, what we don't do with Medicaid, we just shift to the nonprofit and the for-profit healthcare sector. And hospitals just have to write off more in terms of patient care. I mean, the reality is we are all living longer and we're dying of different things than we did, you know, 10 years, even 10 years ago, but much less 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. I mean, I recently had a tooth taken out and I was talking to my dentist about the fact that, I mean, how did people survive this kind of thing 100 years ago when we didn't have anesthesia and all this kind of stuff? And her answer was very simple. We didn't. Mm-hmm. People, I mean, not even 200 years ago, tooth abscess was the leading cause of death in the world. Now the answer is diarrhea, dehydration, which we don't suffer from that much in this country. But, you know, we're trying to deal with cancers and heart disease and strokes and whatnot that you don't have to worry about until you reach 80 or 85 often, even though too much cancer happens at younger ages. We all get that. But we've got to change the way we think about healthcare, because the reality is we are facing bigger challenges. So of course we're spending more now today because we're treating macular degeneration because we're living long enough to treat it. So there are some fundamental shifts that are going on.
But at some place you're going to have to cut. That budget is going to need to be cut again next year.
Well, the issue around healthcare is, especially, I mean, if you think it's broken now, wait till the federal government takes it over. Show me something the federal government does well, and we'll have them do more of it.
Well,
and healthcare in the federal system is not one of them.
Every time you talk about cutting healthcare in the federal system, specifically Medicare, people go berserk because it does work very well, and the administrative cost there is less than 3%. We actually fund it with the government and provide it with private payors. And there are those kinds of partnerships that we can figure out how to do. Part of the problem with healthcare, of course, is the consumer is insulated from the direct market, but it also doesn't have any of the attributes of a free market. I mean, you don't choose to fall and break your leg off your motorcycle and you're laying there trying to figure out, okay, who's the cheapest, who's the fastest, who will get me on my feet best. It doesn't really relate very well to a market, so we have to rethink all of that.
But insulating the consumer from the market and not making them responsible for any component of the payment, et cetera, doesn't prove any accountability to the user either. So what we've seen, and we even tried to, we had one attempt, actually the governor vetoed one of the significant reform attempts under Medicaid, which was bringing the consumer to the table with some of their own skin in the game, i.e. a payment for services at a very small amount, and we couldn't even get that passed. So, I mean, we could have a whole other 4 or 5 shows on this alone and still just touch the surface. But,
and I think next year, Medicaid, education, these are again going to be issues that we are probably going to hear a lot about as you struggle to balance the budget again.
And I just came from the forecast, which happens quarterly, and the year that we're in right now that ends in another week or two, June 30th, we've got an extra $67 million, all of which will go into the education fund. And next year, according to Legislative Council, we'll have another $150 million in round numbers. So we won't hopefully be having to cut from where we are. The cuts will come from the increased demand that we can't meet.
All right, and on that good news, let's wrap. That is a wrap of the first session of the 68th General Assembly. Thank you for joining us here at the Colorado Channel.